The coldest silence Elvis Presley had ever heard did not come from an empty concert hall. It came from the back seat of his own Cadillac. Everyone inside the little Tennessee repair shop believed the king of rock and roll had stopped by for something completely ordinary. A routine brake inspection, a quick cup of coffee, a few signatures for the mechanics before driving away again. But less than 20 minutes later, a newborn baby's cry echoed from somewhere inside Elvis's car. And before the morning was over, the greatest mystery of Elvis Presley's life would begin, not on a concert stage, not inside Graceland, but beneath the leather seat of a black Cadillac. What the old mechanic found hidden there would force Elvis to face a promise buried beneath nearly 2 decades of fame. A promise, he believed, had disappeared forever. Yet someone had spent almost 20 years making sure it found its way back to him. The autumn wind rolled across the empty highway like a warning. Leaves danced over the cracked pavement as a black Cadillac Coupe de Ville slowly turned into a tiny repair garage sitting alone beside an old gas station outside Memphis, Tennessee. The faded wooden sign hanging above the entrance simply read, Earl's Auto Service. The building looked forgotten by time. Rust stained the metal roof. Old tires leaned against weathered walls. Broken headlights filled dusty shelves beside coffee cans packed with rusty bolts. Inside, the smell of engine oil mixed with burnt coffee in cold morning air. The bell above the garage door jingled softly. Every mechanic stopped working, not because of the car, because of the man driving it. Elvis Presley stepped out, wearing a dark leather jacket over a simple black shirt. Dark sunglasses hid his tired eyes. His famous smile appeared for only a moment before disappearing again. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. The previous months had been relentless. Television appearances, recording sessions, interviews, meetings, managers, fans. Millions of people knew his face. Almost nobody knew the loneliness behind it. He removed his sunglasses and smiled politely. "Morning, gentlemen." The mechanics froze. One young apprentice nearly dropped the wrench in his hand. The older workers exchanged nervous glances. It wasn't every day the biggest music star in America casually walked into a garage. From the far corner emerged Earl Thompson. His gray beard was stained with grease. His back had become slightly bent after nearly 50 years of repairing automobiles. But his hands remained steady, strong, experienced. He wiped them on a faded cloth before extending one toward Elvis. "You've picked a quiet morning." Elvis chuckled. "I was hoping for exactly that." Earl nodded toward the Cadillac. "What seems to be bothering her?" Elvis looked back at the car almost affectionately. "The brakes feel strange." "Anything else?" "No," he hesitated. "At least, I don't think so." Earl smiled. "We'll take a look." Elvis handed over the keys. As the Cadillac slowly rolled onto the hydraulic lift, sunlight reflected across its polished black paint. The car looked perfect, elegant, powerful, untouchable, much like its owner. But appearances had fooled people before. Elvis walked toward a tiny waiting area where an old plastic chair sat beside a coffee machine older than most of the mechanics working there. He poured himself a cup. Black, no sugar. Steam rose gently as he stared through the dusty window into the garage. For the first time in weeks, no cameras followed him, no reporters, no screaming fans. Only the familiar sounds of tools striking metal, the rhythmic clicking of ratchets,
compressed air hissing, an old radio quietly playing country music. It almost felt peaceful. Across the garage, Earl carefully inspected the brake lines. Everything seemed ordinary. He checked the front suspension. Nothing unusual. He rotated each wheel.
Still nothing. Strange, he muttered. The brakes should be fine. One of the younger mechanics looked underneath. Maybe it's the rear axle? Earl crawled beneath the vehicle. His flashlight slowly swept across decades of dust collected beneath the frame. Nothing. He climbed back out. Something bothered him, not mechanically, instinctively. Machines had personalities. After repairing thousands of cars, Earl had learned to trust feelings that couldn't be explained. This Cadillac felt different. He opened the driver's door, inspected beneath the dashboard. Nothing. Glove compartment. Nothing. Trunk. Perfectly clean. Too clean. He frowned. Elvis noticed. Everything all right? Earl shrugged. Probably. But he didn't sound convinced. Minutes passed. Outside, gray clouds slowly swallowed the morning sunlight. The garage became quieter. Even the old radio suddenly faded into static. Then, a sound interrupted everything. Soft, almost impossible to hear. One mechanic looked toward the entrance. Did somebody bring a baby? Another shook his head. No. The sound came again, longer this time. A tiny cry, weak, fragile. Every head turned. Silence filled the garage. Nobody spoke. The cry echoed once more. Earl stood perfectly still. His heartbeat quickened. The sound wasn't outside. It wasn't upstairs. It wasn't coming from the office. It came from somewhere inside the garage itself. The apprentice whispered, "Did you hear that?" Nobody answered. Another cry, longer now, desperate. Elvis slowly lowered his coffee cup. His expression changed instantly. Confusion, concern, disbelief. Earl closed his eyes, listening. There, again. This time he knew exactly where it came from. He looked directly at the Cadillac. His voice barely escaped his lips. No. Another cry, louder, impossible to mistake. The mechanics stared at one another. One laughed nervously. That's impossible. Nobody else laughed. Earl slowly walked toward the rear passenger door. Every footstep echoed across the concrete floor. Elvis followed several steps behind. What is it? Earl didn't answer. He placed one trembling hand against the leather seat. Another cry. Now everyone heard it clearly. Coming from inside the car. Elvis frowned. That can't be. Earl swallowed hard. I've repaired cars my entire life. His voice trembled. I've heard loose bolts, broken fuel pumps, animals trapped under hoods. But he looked directly into Elvis's eyes. I've never heard this. The crying became louder. The young apprentice instinctively stepped backward. Someone quietly crossed himself. Another mechanic whispered, "Good Lord." Elvis reached for the rear door handle. His hand stopped halfway. For reasons he couldn't explain, he suddenly became afraid. Not of what was inside, but of what finding it
might change forever. The crying continued. Tiny, helpless, waiting.
Earl slowly pulled his toolbox closer. If it's coming from beneath the seat... He opened a worn leather case filled with screwdrivers polished by decades of use. One by one, he began removing the rear seat cushions. Every screw hitting the floor sounded like thunder inside the silent garage. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Only the baby continued crying beneath layers of leather and steel. Elvis stood frozen. His coffee had long since slipped from his fingers, spilling unnoticed across the concrete. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had owned this Cadillac for years. He knew every scratch, every mile, every memory. And yet, he had never known there was something hidden beneath the seat. Earl removed another bolt, then another. The leather cushion slowly loosened. The crying became louder, much louder. One mechanic whispered, "There really is someone in there." Earl looked toward Elvis. "You'd better come closer." Elvis slowly stepped forward. His breathing became shallow. The final latch released with a metallic click. Earl carefully lifted the heavy leather seat. At first, nothing. Only darkness, dust, old wiring. Then, his flashlight revealed something impossible. A small wooden compartment built deep into the frame, handcrafted, invisible from above, hidden so perfectly that no ordinary inspection would ever discover it. The crying came directly from inside. Earl reached toward the tiny brass latch. His fingers shook. Nobody dared interrupt him. Slowly, very slowly, the old mechanic opened the secret compartment. And every life inside that garage changed forever. The old mechanic's hands froze on the edge of the hidden compartment. For several endless seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the newborn had stopped crying. It was as if the entire garage had surrendered itself to a silence too heavy to carry. Then, a tiny whimper broke through the stillness. Earl slowly reached both hands into the compartment. His rough fingers, scarred by nearly half a century of repairing engines, suddenly became as gentle as those of a grandfather lifting his first grandchild. Carefully, very carefully, he raised a small bundle wrapped in an ivory-colored blanket. The baby couldn't have been more than a few days old. Her tiny fingers curled weakly around the edge of the blanket. Her cheeks were pale from the cold. A few strands of dark hair rested against her forehead. She opened her eyes for only a moment. Deep blue, quiet, almost impossibly calm. The entire garage stood frozen. Nobody spoke. One mechanic slowly removed his cap. Another wiped his greasy hands against his overalls without realizing he was trembling. Elvis stared at the baby as if the world around him no longer existed. His lips barely moved. My God. Earl carefully handed the little girl toward him. I think you should hold her. Elvis instinctively stepped backward. No, his voice cracked. I can't. You have to. I've never. His sentence disappeared. For millions of people, Elvis Presley looked fearless. He had performed before enormous crowds.
He had stood beneath blinding lights while entire stadiums screamed his name. Yet this tiny newborn, frightened him more than every stage he had ever walked onto. Slowly, almost against his own will, he extended his arms. The old mechanic gently placed the baby into them. The little girl stopped crying immediately. Her tiny hand wrapped itself around one of Elvis's fingers. A tear escaped his eye before he even realized he was crying.
Nobody inside the garage dared speak. Something impossible had just happened. The baby had become completely peaceful the moment Elvis held her. Earl quietly whispered, "I think she knows she's safe." Elvis swallowed hard. "I don't even know who she is." Before anyone could answer, one of the younger mechanics pointed toward the hidden compartment. "There's something else." Everyone looked down. The compartment wasn't empty. Folded neatly beneath where the baby had been lying rested an old cream-colored blanket. Beside it, a small cloth pouch. And underneath both, a tiny portable reel-to-reel tape recorder. The metal casing was scratched, dust covered the speaker, but it looked carefully protected, almost intentionally preserved. Earl slowly removed everything. As he unfolded the blanket, something stitched into one corner caught his attention. Blue thread, hand-sewn. One single word. Grace. His face suddenly changed. "What is it?" Elvis asked. Earl silently handed him the blanket. The moment Elvis read the embroidered name, his fingers lost all strength. The blanket slipped halfway from his hands. His breathing stopped. "No." His voice barely existed. "No." He stared at those 5 letters as if they belonged to another lifetime. Grace. Not just any name. His mother's name. The woman who had believed in him before anyone else. The woman whose prayers had carried him through poverty. The woman whose death had shattered him years earlier. His knees nearly gave way. One mechanic quickly caught his shoulder before he collapsed. "Mr. Presley." Elvis never answered. His eyes remained fixed on the stitching. Someone, somehow, had deliberately chosen that name. But why? The apprentice looked confused. "Is that important?" Earl answered quietly. "You have no idea." Elvis slowly pressed the blanket against his chest. His memories flooded back all at once. His mother's laughter, Sunday mornings, small church pews, simple dinners. The tiny house where every dream had begun. He had not heard her name spoken aloud in years, yet now it rested inside his own hands, wrapped around a child he had never seen before. The silence became unbearable. Then Earl noticed something else. There. Inside the cloth pouch, he reached carefully. His fingers touched metal. He pulled out a small silver key. Attached to it was a faded paper tag. The handwriting had nearly disappeared. Only a few words remained readable. For Elvis. Nothing more. No last name, no address, no explanation. The mechanics exchanged uneasy glances. This no longer felt like an abandoned child. Someone had planned every detail. Someone had wanted Elvis, and only Elvis, to find her. Before anyone could say another word, the telephone inside the office rang. The sharp sound startled everyone. Earl hurried toward it. Within minutes, The sheriff's department had been notified. An ambulance was already on its way. As Earl returned, another discovery waited inside the compartment. The small reel-to-reel recorder. Its batteries were long dead. One of the mechanics hurried into the storage room and returned carrying an old portable power supply used for testing radios. It might still work. Nobody was certain. The tape looked nearly 20 years old. Dust covered every corner. The magnetic reels had faded with age. Earl carefully connected the recorder. His thumb hovered over the play button. Everyone instinctively stepped closer. Even the baby remained strangely quiet in Elvis's arms. The machine clicked. Nothing. Static. More static. A crackling hiss filled the garage. One mechanic sighed. I don't think. Suddenly, a woman's voice emerged through the speaker. Weak, shaking, as though every word had cost her another breath. Elvis. Every person inside the garage froze. The voice continued. If you're hearing this, then I wasn't strong enough. A heavy cough interrupted her. Several long seconds passed before she found the strength to continue. The little girl you're holding is the greatest gift God ever gave me. I've hidden her where I knew only fate could return her to you. Another painful silence. Then came words that struck Elvis like lightning. You once made me a promise. You probably believe you've forgotten it. But I never did. Tears slowly rolled down Elvis's face. His heartbeat became louder than the tape itself. The woman continued. You visited us every Saturday. You played guitar for children nobody else remembered. You told stories. You made us laugh. And one rainy afternoon, I asked you a question. The garage disappeared around Elvis. The walls, the mechanics, the ambulance sirens approaching in the distance. Everything faded. His mind had already traveled nearly 20 years into the past. Back to a forgotten children's home on the edge of Memphis. Back before the records, before Hollywood, before fame. Back when he was simply a shy young man carrying an old guitar with holes in its worn leather case. The tape played on. I asked you, if one day I wasn't here, would you protect my child? You smiled. You took my hand. And you promised. The recorder fell silent for several seconds. Only soft breathing remained. Then the woman whispered words that shattered what little strength Elvis still had. I believed you. I believed you more than I believed tomorrow. Another cough. Longer this time. Painful. Almost unbearable to hear. If life was kind, I would have thanked you myself. But if it wasn't, I prayed this recording would. Her breathing became weaker. Please, don't let her grow up believing she was abandoned. Tell her her mother loved her until her very last heartbeat. And tell her I never stopped believing in you. The tape suddenly clicked. Silence. No music. No farewell. Only the soft spinning of empty reels. Nobody inside the garage realized they were crying until tears began falling onto the concrete floor. Elvis slowly lowered his head. His shoulders trembled. For almost 20 years, he had believed that chapter of his life had vanished forever. But memories have strange ways of surviving. Sometimes they wait inside old songs. Sometimes inside faded photographs. And sometimes they wait beneath the back seat of a black Cadillac, until the exact moment your heart is finally ready to remember. Outside, the distant sound of police sirens and an ambulance grew louder with every passing second. But Elvis never looked toward the road. His eyes remained fixed on the sleeping baby resting peacefully against his chest. Because somewhere deep inside, he already knew. This was not the end of the mystery. It was only the beginning. Someone still had to answer one impossible question. Who had secretly placed the baby inside his Cadillac? Without anyone seeing a single thing, blue and red lights painted the walls of Earl's little garage as sheriff's deputies and paramedics hurried inside. Nobody spoke above a whisper. The newborn girl was carefully examined inside the ambulance. Apart from mild dehydration and the cold, she was healthy. It was nothing short of a miracle. The sheriff, William Carter, had spent nearly 30 years investigating murders, robberies, disappearances, and every kind of crime imaginable. But this, he admitted he had never seen anything like it. He approached Elvis quietly. "Mr. Presley, I need to ask you a difficult question." Elvis nodded. "I understand. Do you recognize the child?" "No." "Do you know who placed her in your vehicle?" "No." "Did you know the woman on the tape?" Elvis closed his eyes. For several seconds, he couldn't answer. Finally, he whispered, "I knew her before anyone knew me." Sheriff Carter looked confused. Elvis stared toward the highway, disappearing into the gray Tennessee morning. "I met her nearly 20 years ago. Long before the sold-out concerts, long before Hollywood, long before the gold records. There had been a forgotten children's home on the edge of Memphis. The building was old. Its windows leaked every winter. Its walls needed paint. Money was always scarce. Yet every Saturday afternoon, one young man arrived carrying a worn-out guitar. He wasn't famous, he wasn't wealthy. He wasn't even certain music would become his future. He simply loved making children smile. That young man was Elvis Presley. The children waited for him every week. Some had no parents. Some had been abandoned. Others had illnesses that doctors quietly admitted they could never cure. But whenever Elvis walked through the front door, singing and laughing, for a few precious hours, none of those children felt forgotten. Among them was a quiet young girl named Emily Grace Turner. She couldn't run like the others. A serious heart condition had confined much of her childhood to hospital beds and orphanage rooms. Yet she smiled more than anyone else. She loved listening to Elvis play guitar. She believed he would one day become famous. "You belong on the radio," she often teased him. Elvis would laugh every time. "And who's going to listen to me?" "I will." "What if you're busy?" "I'll still listen." "What if I'm halfway across the world?" Emily would grin. "I'll find a radio." Years passed. Elvis visited whenever he could. The friendship never became romance. It became something deeper. Trust, hope, family. Then, one rainy evening, everything changed. Emily asked Elvis to sit beside her hospital bed. She looked weaker than he had ever seen her. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "If one day," she struggled for breath, "I'm not here anymore." Elvis immediately interrupted. "Don't say that." She smiled sadly. "Please." He nodded. "If I ever have a child, and something happens to me, promise you won't let my baby grow up believing nobody cared?" Elvis took her fragile hand. Without hesitation, "I promise."
He never imagined those words would follow him for the rest of his life. A few months later, his career exploded. Everything happened so quickly. Television, recording contracts, tours, movies, millions of fans. The world suddenly wanted every second of his life. He tried visiting the orphanage again. It had closed. The children had been relocated. No records remained. Emily simply disappeared. For years, he searched whenever he returned to Memphis. Nobody knew where she had gone. Eventually, life pulled him farther away. Not because he stopped caring, because he stopped believing he would ever find her again. Until now. The sheriff listened without interrupting. When Elvis finished, neither man spoke for a long time. Finally, Sheriff Carter removed his hat.
I think we should continue investigating. Over the following weeks, detectives traced every clue. The blanket, the tape recorder, the key, the handwriting, hospital records, old adoption files, church archives. Then, nearly 3 weeks later, one phone call changed everything. Emily Grace Turner had never forgotten Elvis. After leaving the orphanage, she had been adopted by an elderly couple living outside Nashville. Doctors had warned she might never live a long life. Against every expectation, she survived. Years later, she married a kind young carpenter. Together, they dreamed of raising a family, but happiness proved painfully short. Her husband was killed in a highway accident before their first child was born. Soon afterward, Emily learned her heart disease had returned. This time, there would be no recovery. Knowing she had little time left, she wrote dozens of letters. Most were never mailed. One was addressed to Elvis.
She knew reaching him directly would be almost impossible. Then she remembered something. Years earlier, during a charity event, she had quietly seen Elvis arrive in the same black Cadillac. She noticed an unusual repair panel beneath the rear seat, while a mechanic demonstrated hidden storage used by previous owners. An impossible idea formed. With help from a family friend who once worked on classic Cadillacs, she carefully placed blankets, milk bottles, the tape recorder, and her sleeping newborn daughter inside the hidden compartment only hours before Elvis planned to visit Earl's garage for scheduled maintenance. She left one final note with the mechanic who secretly helped her. If fate is kind, he'll find her. If not, at least I tried. Emily returned to the hospital. She died before sunrise. She never learned that her daughter had been found safely. When Sheriff Carter finished reading the report, the room fell silent. No crime, no conspiracy, no scandal. Only the final wish of a dying mother who trusted one promise made by a kind young volunteer nearly 20 years earlier. Several months passed. The newspapers slowly stopped writing about the mystery. Television moved on. The world found another headline. But Elvis never moved on. He visited the little girl every single day. He fed her, rocked her to sleep, read bedtime stories, sang quiet lullabies with the same guitar he had once carried into that orphanage. Whenever she cried, she calmed the moment she heard his voice. The nurses often smiled. It's almost like she already knows you. Maybe, somewhere deep inside, she did. After lengthy legal proceedings, and with the approval of the authorities and Emily's remaining relatives, Elvis became the little girl's legal guardian. He named her Grace Emily. Grace, for the mother who had taught him unconditional love. Emily, for the woman who had trusted him when he was still nobody.
One winter evening, Elvis stood backstage before another sold-out concert. More than 50,000 people filled the arena. The announcer called his name. The crowd erupted. But Elvis didn't walk toward the stage immediately. Instead, he turned around. Inside a quiet dressing room, a small wooden crib rested beside the wall. The little girl slept peacefully beneath the same blanket with the blue stitched name, Grace. Elvis gently kissed her forehead. "I almost forgot my promise." His voice trembled, "but you brought it back to me." He smiled through tears, "And this time, I'm never letting go." He walked onto the stage. The applause was deafening, the lights brighter than ever. Yet something was different. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. That night he sang with a warmth nobody had heard before. Every lyric carried gratitude. Every note carried forgiveness. Every smile carried peace. When the final song ended, the audience rose to its feet. The applause continued for several minutes. A reporter waiting backstage asked the same question everyone wanted answered. "Mr. Presley, tonight's performance felt different." "It did. Who was it dedicated to?" Elvis looked toward the dressing room. A gentle smile appeared, the kind that comes only after a broken heart finally heals. Then he answered softly, "People think promises are written on paper. They're not. The ones that truly matter are written on the heart. And no matter how many years pass, a faithful heart never forgets." The next morning, newspapers praised another unforgettable Elvis Presley concert. Millions admired the music. Thousands talked about the emotion in his voice. But none of them knew the real reason behind his smile. Because while the world believed the king of rock and roll had gone home after another successful performance, Elvis quietly carried a sleeping little girl to his Cadillac. He fastened her safely into the back seat, started the engine, looked once toward the stars above Tennessee, and whispered words meant for someone who was no longer there. "You kept believing in me. I hope I finally became the man you always believed I could be." The Cadillac disappeared into the night, not carrying a legend, but carrying a promise that had found its way home.